All right, so this is the review for the midterm exam for world history. And first off, there's a lot of questions that kind of repeat the same idea. Especially the first five are pretty much all about the Neolithic Revolution. Overall, there's 90 questions, but I only have a hard copy of this test, so I'm not able to edit it. Otherwise, I would edit some of it. All right, so I'm just going to kind of go through the main ideas that are on the test that you need to make sure that you know. So as far as the Neolithic Revolution goes, that's what we started talking about at the very beginning of this class, and that's, of course, when humans went from hunting and gathering to food producing. This led to the domestication of animals. This led to civilization because people settled in communities and you had a surplus of food. That of course led to these towns and cities being developed, and this all occurred, of course, along rivers. Make sure you remember that your first civilizations are all river valley civilizations, because obviously you need access to water for trade and of course to drink and things like that as well. So Neolithic Revolution develops civilization, leads to domestication of animals, creates a surplus of food. It's going to lead to specialized workers that can do other things other than just food produce. And then, of course, they all settled along rivers as well. You need to know where the first four civilizations were. So that's Egypt along the Nile River, in Mesopotamia, which is the Middle East, along the Tigris and Euphrates River, in India along the Indus River Valley, and in China along the Huanghe River. All right, and then there's several vignettes, little readings that you have to go through that answer the questions based on the reading. Those really should not be that hard. Just make sure you read them carefully as you go through that. And then, of course, another thing about the Neolithic Revolution is that it required a corporation by groups of people. People had to work together in order to make that happen. And of course, in building cities and creating a civilization out of it. And like I said, know where these civilizations were. You'll see a question with a map. You'll need to know, where those were. And then you need to know the 5 characteristics of a civilization. So, things like advanced cities, record keeping, advanced technology, specialized workers, things like that. So, know your 5 characteristics of a civilization. And then also know how these early civilizations impacted the Greeks and the Romans, so your bigger civilizations that come later. So the early civilizations, your river valley civilizations, invented writing, they invented the sailboat, first written law code, things like that. Well, all those obviously had a huge impact on the Greeks and the Romans, so that led to things that the Greeks and Romans copied. And then moving on to Greece, the city of Athens, you should know, of course, was a city-state. That's where democracy was developed. The Parthenon was built there. You had major philosophers like Socrates and Plato all came out of Athens. And then the Roman civilization impact it had on Western Europe. And Rome, really the big thing they brought is a common system of written law, and this whole idea that basically that the government is responsible for the welfare of the people. So that came about, so civilizations in Europe after Rome, copied that idea. And then if you were to compare early versions of law, like the 5 relationships by Confucianism, the 10 Commandments, the Eightfold Path, they're similar in the sense that they're codes of behavior for the people to follow. And the same thing if you compare Hammurabi's Code, 10 Commandments, and the 12 Tables from Rome. Again, it's rules of behavior for the society as a whole. All right, and then the terms like Dharma and Moksha, where that comes from Hinduism. Moksha is the idea of enlightenment within Hinduism. Dharma is the good and bad deeds that follow you. So again, just generally know your religions and your basic terms for each one. They're holy books. Where they're geographically located, when they developed, basic beliefs, things like that. All right, and then looking at Hammurabi's Code and comparing that to the Qin dynasty, where they used legalism to govern their society, what they had in common, and what they had in common was harsh punishment. So Hammurabi's Code was the idea of eye for an eye. So you steal something, you get your hand chopped off. And then in the Qin dynasty, with legalism, it was very harsh. So for example, if you were traveling from one town to another in China and you didn't have the proper paperwork with you, then you may get your nose chopped off or your ear chopped off. And so, of course, the idea is that these harsh punishments will lead to an orderly society, that you're not going to do anything wrong because the punishment's so incredibly harsh. All right, and then going back to Greece, you need to know why early Greece did not unify into like an empire, and they remained separate city-states, and that's because of their mountainous topography. So the mountainous regions, and of course the islands as well, separated them to where these cities could not unite together into a single empire. All right, and then of course Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, you should know they were philosophers of ancient Greece. And then the Gupta Empire in India, they're known for creating the concept of zero, the expansion of the caste system. Also created the decimal system as well, so all that came out of the Gupta Empire in India. And really the key there thing that should click is the caste system. Anytime you see the caste system, which of course is the social class system within Hinduism, where you're born into that particular class, the only way you can move up and down is through reincarnation. So after being, living out a good life, you can move up. If you have a bad life, you'll move down. So anytime you see caste system in a sentence, we're talking about India every time. So if you get confused on that, just know it's always going to be something about India. And of course, Gupta Empire was in India. And then looking at the exchange of silk and spices and the spread of Buddhism on the Silk Roads, that's an example of cultural diffusion. So diffusion is the spreading of an idea. So Buddhism started in India, but then went along the Silk Roads into China, spread to China, and also throughout the Middle East. So when we see the spreading of goods and ideas, that's called diffusion. All right, and then Han China or Han Dynasty in the Roman Empire, they traded quite a bit and became very wealthy because of that. So they created the extensive trade networks known as the Silk Roads that brought them together. There was a couple $1 billion worth of trade done every year between Rome and Han China. And you're going to see several charts as well. So, like for example, here we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, and really just understand in general that a lot of Western ideas, of course when I'm talking about Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, a lot of our ideas and institutions came from the Greeks and the Romans. So, the Greeks created democracy. Rome, they developed a representative government. They also developed architecture that we use today, like the arch and the dome, and things like that, and the use of concrete. So just knowing they influence where we are today and how we structure our society. And then also, again, looking to see that the Greeks and Romans were also influenced by early river civilizations. So when early river civilizations, which influenced Greek and Romans, which influenced the rise of Western Europe and the United States. So we all trace all the way back to the ancient river valley civilizations. All right, and then the Maya, you need to notice some achievements of the Mayan Empire. So for the Mayans, they, of course, grew corn, tomatoes, and beans. They built pyramids as well. They made human sacrifices to the sun god because they believed it was human blood is what powered the sun across the sky. Came up with a calendar, a 365-day calendar, and, of course, the use of the number 0 as well. And, of course, what brought about the decline of Rome? There's several factors that brought about the decline of Rome. Of course, one of them was over-reliance on troops. They recruited from non-Roman peoples that aren't going to be loyal, and there's a plethora of other problems as well, like debt and over-expanding and things like that. All right, and then what unified Western European countries, or Western Europe in general, during the Middle Ages? Remember the Middle Ages, this when after the fall of Rome, everybody separated, and so the only thing that unites them is the common faith in the same religion, so in Christianity. That's the one thing that unites them. Other than that, language has divided them, geography has divided them, and of course they're not under the same government anymore. All right, and then again, some more quotes and stuff. So again, going back to the Catholic Church during this time, I believe that there was no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So, you had to be part of the Catholic Church to go to heaven. Was some of the beliefs that started coming out of the Catholic Church at that time. Remember, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was the main economic power, the largest landowner in all of Europe, and the main source of learning during the Middle Ages. Of course, all came from the Catholic Church. And this the difference is between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholics. Eastern Orthodox, they believe that the Patriarch is the head of the church and not the Pope. So the Eastern Orthodox, they listen to the Patriarch, whereas in the Catholic Church listens to the Pope. And then something that the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox share a belief in, and that's the belief that Jesus acted to redeem humankind through his death and resurrection. All right, there's also going to be several charts where you have to like fill in the blank and stuff like that. And so again, just know, unique views of Roman Catholicism. So, the belief in saints, bishops and priests can't marry, the belief in the Trinity, and things like that. So it's all the Roman Catholic Church. And then you need to know the manorial system in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. So basically, that's where you had a large estate with everything on it, all the farms and everything, and then of course the peasants living on it, a castle to protect them, knights protecting it. So basically, manorial system is just the idea that you have this self-contained society within this estate with everything you need there. So basically, it's a village with all its farming land and stuff like that around it. And then you should know, like the feudal pyramid and what the feudal system was and how those relationships interacted with each other. And then, why we saw in Western Europe after the fall of Rome, we see obviously a decline of learning, even infrastructure decline, roads and bridges and things like that. And that, of course, was because of the fall of Rome. After the fall of Rome, all those things began to fall apart. All right, and then the reason why feudalism developed in Western Europe mainly is because the kings couldn't defend their own lands, and so they needed to come up with a way to have the lands produce food, using peasants to do that, and then, of course, having knights to protect the land and lords and stuff like that to divide the land up among them. And then you'll see a diagram of the manorial system. And then why Arab merchants wanted to extend their contacts with Western African kingdoms. So we didn't talk a lot about these Western African kingdoms, but really quite simply, the main thing they did was trade. And it was gold and salt. And, we saw the video where it mentioned about how salt was so valuable. Just keep in mind, you could not have food really without salt. You needed it as a preserver. And so salt was really just as valuable as gold at the time. So the Arabs, so people from the Middle East, they extended the trade with Western African countries so they get access to the gold and salt trade in Western Africa, North and Western Africa. All right, and then Muslim and Hindu societies. So Hindus, of course, mainly being in India, generally don't get along. And one of the big things is that the Muslims believe that the teachings of the Quran go very contrary or against the teachings of the caste system and reincarnation and things like that. So they just don't really go with it at all. All right, getting to the end of the medieval Europe, what brought about the end? Of course, one of the big reasons for the end of the Middle Ages was the Black Death, because Black Death killed a lot of people, but then gave opportunity for peasants to gain more economic power, to own land, and not have to be peasants anymore. So that helped end. There's actually two questions that it's really asking the same thing. So the idea that you have labor shortages, which gives these opportunities for the peasants that survived. All right, and then the Crusades, which started in 1095. Remember, of course, the Crusades, the goal was to recapture the Holy Land, recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims. But one good thing that came out about this is that you see trade increase again between the Middle East and also East Asia and Europe as well. So even though there's a lot of horrible things that happened, at least trade did come back. Now, the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417, that had to do with the three popes that were elected. And of course, understanding that weakened the power and prestige of the Catholic Church. When you have three popes and they're fighting for power and they're excommunicating one another. All right, the Aztecs, the writing system used pictographs, kind of like the Egyptians. And so a similar writing system to the Egyptians. Mayans also had a similar system as well. And then looking at Tang and Song China, this is a chart question. All right, they're the ones that developed a lot of key inventions. Like the compass, porcelain, paper currency, gunpowder, things like that. So just know those basic things that they came up with. So paper currency, gunpowder, and of course a printing press as well. All right, and then there's a Venn diagram comparing the Silk Road trade and the African gold salt trade, and what they have in common is what you need to know. So the main thing they have in common is they had to overcome huge geographical barriers. So the African gold salt trade was through the Sahara Desert, which is obviously going to be hard to get through. The Silk Road went through the Asian steppe, which is just a huge amount of emptiness, and mainly had to deal with raiders and things like that because of just the open area. There was no way to really protect yourself. And so you had, again, a vast amount of land you had to get across where there was hardly anybody. All right, and then Of course, Islam became the dominant religion across the Sahara, a lot of it because of the trade with West Africa. And then looking at the bubonic plague or the Black Death, here's a map question. And again, just understanding that the Black Death followed the trade routes. That's how it spread, was through the trade routes as well. All right, and then a couple important people in history: Hammurabi, Draco, and Justinian. And just know that they really developed rules of law when it came to society. So you have Hammurabi's code. Draco came up with a set of laws in Athens, and then Justinian, of course, the Justinian code we talked about in the Byzantine Empire. And then another chart question, and this is looking at English common law and basically how it developed. So the idea of circuit judges, petit juris, Magna Carta, and common law. And basically just the whole idea is that over time, more power went to the individuals in England and protected their rights. And of course, eventually led to our revolution here. And then another Venn diagram looking at the idea, an idea from the Digest of Justinian, so Justinian Code, in English common law, basically the idea of that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so the person that is accusing someone of a crime, they're the ones that have to produce the evidence that that happened, not the one being accused. They don't have to prove their innocence. They're innocent until proven guilty. All right. And then, of course, know where Islam was mainly located. The Islamic empires from the Middle East through North Africa and southern part of Spain. So you may see a map question on that. And then another chart question. And then, which really had to do with forms of government and stuff like that. That's pretty easy. And then looking at the civil service system in China again. So the main thing, we talked about how they had to take a test and that would determine, where they ended up in society. But I didn't really hit too big on what it is they had to actually study. So the main thing they studied was the teachings of Confucius, so Confucianism. And the test was based on that. And then based on that is where they were placed. Because the whole idea is that you wanted an intelligent ruling class. So if you understood philosophy really well, especially the philosophy of Confucianism, then you were considered intelligent and you could work higher up in society. All right, and then comparing Western Roman Empire to Eastern Roman Empire, especially when we get close to the fall of Rome. And the western part, of course, they spoke Latin. It was mainly a rural society. It was agriculturally based. It wasn't very wealthy. The eastern half, so where Constantinople was mainly Greek. You had a lot of cities. You had trade, and it was much wealthier. So the way to think of the Roman Empire at that time was kind of like the North and South. The United States before the Civil War, South was more rural, agricultural, less wealthy, whereas the North had more cities, better trade, and was wealthier. So it's the same thing. It's just in this case, the Western Roman Empire is like the South in the U.S. Eastern Roman Empire is like the North in the U.S. All right, and then why Constantinople was a good place for trade, and really just had to do with their location. It was a great location with access over to the Middle East on those trade routes. And then in a meritocracy, this is going back to China again. So this is where, your position's based on merits, so based on your test scores, where you're going to be placed. And then when you're looking at dynasties in China, so let's say 4 emperors came from the same dynasty, you can conclude that those 4 emperors were related to each other from the same family. They come from the same dynasty. All right, and then looking at Ghana in Africa. So Ghana is one of the trading empires in Western Africa, and their main thing was salt. So they mined salt. Of course, there were mainly salt merchants there. So there's basically 3 questions on that, mainly hitting the fact that they mined salt. And then going to the Renaissance. So, of course, the Renaissance, that came about because the rediscovery of the ancient texts by Italian humanist scholars, when the Ottoman Empire took over Constantinople. Those philosophers left. They brought a lot of the works with them. In Italy, they rediscovered these works and brought about, the classics, basically, learning and writing and all that. And then we look at the Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange brought about new plants and animals to Europe and America as well. But we also, of course, see diseases come from Europe over to the Americas, killing a lot of the native peoples here in the Americas. And then back in the Renaissance, of course, the painters, we see more of a realistic style. They're trying to actually make it look real. And then, of course, we see perspective come back to paintings again. And then a quote from Martin Luther getting into the Reformation. Of course, remembering Luther um, believed that faith alone saved you, that faith alone would bring you salvation. You didn't have to try to earn it through good works. And of course, remembering he brought about the Reformation as well. Of course, we watched a movie about that. All right, and then the political impact of the Reformation. So you start seeing basically the rise of secular rulers increase their power. Secular meaning non-religious. And so instead of the Catholic Church being the main power, now these other rulers, these kings and stuff like that, are taking over and are now the ultimate powers in Europe. And then another big shift that happened in Europe with the Reformation is that you don't see religious unity in Europe anymore. So before the Catholic Church, everyone was unified in Western Europe under the Catholic Church. But now you see Catholics and Protestants, and of course different types of Protestants. Lutherans, eventually Presbyterians, Baptists, things like that will come about. All right, and then you'll see a quote talking about kind of the mixture of cultures in the Americas with the European cultures that came in during exploration. So a lot of this, of course, was Spanish and Portuguese. So you're going to see the mixing of Catholicism with these native cultures. And a lot of this happened because Spanish colonists intermarried with Native American women. And so their children are going to have, of course, some of the culture from Spain and Portugal, and then, and of course, some of the culture from their moms, from the Native American culture. So you're going to see this mixture within the belief system. All right, and then of course, with the Spanish coming in, the Aztec and Inca are destroyed, and they're replaced by a new Latin American culture, which again is this blending of Spanish culture, Catholic belief system, and all the native belief and culture. And then, of course, remembering too that a lot of the Aztecs and other native groups were mainly killed by smallpox, wiped out about 90% of the population when the Spanish arrived and other European groups. All right, then reasons for European exploration, of course, wanting to spread the Christian faith, wanting to get access to new trade routes, wanting to become very wealthy, and things like that. And then also an area to sell their goods to, more people to sell their products to and make more money. All right, and then how the Columbian Exchange benefited Europeans. So it brought in new food to Europe, especially corn and potatoes. When we see corn and potatoes introduced to the European diet, we see life expectancy jump big time. And it starts going up, and human population starts increasing much more rapidly because of that, just because of better diet and nutrition, because of corn and potatoes. All right, so again, when you look at like a map showing the Columbian Exchange, so from Europe over to the Americas, we saw things like horses and donkeys, sheep, goats, cattle, cats, rats, mice, wheat, onions, carrots, lettuce, grapes, oranges, and melons. All of that came from Europe over to the Americas. And then from the Americas over to Europe, again, corn, potato, tomato, tobacco, things like that. Chocolate would be another one as well that came from the Americas and went over to Europe. All right, another chart question, again, hitting basically the same idea. Europeans, gained new foodstuffs and wealth and things like that from the Columbian Exchangers and Native Americans. Populations was reduced due to conflict and, of course, smallpox and other diseases. And then looking at the slave trade, the impact on West Africa and the impact it had on the Americas. Obviously, for Africa, you're going to see the destruction of African culture. And then for here in the Americas, they grew cash crops for export. Cash crops are things that you don't eat. So like tobacco, you don't eat it, but it's something you make money off of because it is used. For smoking and things like that. Or cotton would be another cash crop. You use it to make clothes. So you don't eat it. It doesn't help you stay alive. It's just to make clothing. So you still make a lot of money off of it. All right, and then another question basically on the slave trade pretty much hits the same idea, and then a quote about the African slave trade, and basically just getting into the fact that the reason why the African slave trade happened in the first place is that African empires or nations were willing to enslave other people and sell them to the Europeans. So the Europeans didn't actually go in and capture Africans. African leaders were willing to sell their own, I say their own people, it's really kind of like surrounding communities that were weaker, because they made more money off doing that than they would have just selling their raw materials to the Europeans. So it's like, well, I could sell you these products, or I could just enslave these people and sell them to you, and the Europeans will pay more money for that. And so that's why they sold them. All right, and then The Ottoman Empire, you need to know a couple of characteristics of them. So they dominated the trade route between Europe and Asia for a couple of centuries. And of course, the main land route between Europe and Asia went through them as well. And they were the greatest power in Eastern Europe as well until around the 1600s as well. All right, and then Europeans started going around the Ottomans. You need to know why they did that. And so instead of trying to trade with the Ottomans, when they bought stuff from Asia, they started going around Africa. So they started sailing around because, one, it was faster doing it that way, actually, even though it's a really far distance. And two, it was cheaper. You didn't have to worry about going through the Ottomans and dealing with them as well. All right, because of the Ottoman Empire, we also see the spread of Islam to Eastern Europe because the Ottomans controlled Eastern Europe. And so even today, we still see in Southeastern Europe a larger concentration of Muslims because of that empire. All right, and then and basically another chart, and this one's about Ming China. Basically just kind of pointing out that Ming China was involved in global trade. That dynasty really traded with pretty much everyone, had a huge trading fleet. And then another map looking at the exchange of goods, this time between Europe and China. So Europe sold China basically silver, corn, and sweet potatoes, things like that. So basically stuff coming from the Americas, they then sold to China. And then from China, of course, still silk was the main thing, and then, of course, spices, and then porcelain. And porcelain was a big deal. I mean, like I went to a palace in Madrid and in Spain, and one of the rooms, and the entire room is made out of porcelain. And it was a beautiful room, but I mean, like it was highly prized. Especially by the wealthy. All right, then another diagram, and this one's looking at what would be another commercial revolution because of exploration. So we see expansion of money economy, surge in overseas trade, and then, of course, this was spurred by the voyages by England, France, Portugal, and Spain, and then we see joint stock companies and stock exchanges are created because of this. So kind of leading to the modern economy that we see today. All right, and then this philosophy, this economic philosophy is called mercantilism that developed during this time. And this is the whole idea that a country needs to be self-sufficient. So England, for example, being an island, doesn't have all the resources it needs on that island. And so the way for it to be self-sufficient is to gain colonies. So you gain these colonies, like the 13 colonies over here, and then they produce the raw materials that you need to fuel your economy. You bring those raw materials back to your country, so you bring them back to England, and then you develop them into manufactured goods, and then you sell them to your colonies. So your colonies can only buy goods from you. So, for example, the 13 colonies could only buy goods from England. So they produce tobacco and cotton. It goes to England. They make cigars. They make clothing. It goes back to the colonies where they buy those products at a really high price because there is no competition. So it's not like, well, I could get this French shirt instead of this English shirt. No, you can only get the English one. Therefore, it's going to be expensive because the whole idea is that those countries want to keep the money within themselves, within their own country, to where they're making all the money they possibly can, which is really bad, of course, for the colonists because they're having to spend high amounts of money to get these products. So it's the whole idea of being self-sufficient, which is totally opposite of what we do today in our economy. All right, then the printing press by Gutenberg, of course, knowing that created obviously more books becoming readily available, so increased literacy rates, and then, of course, it started challenging those in power as people started questioning those in power. And then the selling of indulgences, going back to the Reformation again. Of course, this idea is that it was pardons that people could buy, so pardons for your sins or forgiveness. So instead of, just asking for forgiveness or going to a priest and confessing, within the Catholic Church, the idea is you had to pay for it, which was, a sign of corruption in the church. And then, of course, the main reformer that believed that anyone could read the Bible and understand it for themselves was Martin Luther. A lot of other reformers thought that as well, but he's the first one that really kind of came up with that. All right, so that is it for the test. So I would watch this video a couple of times, take some notes, do your review, and you should be good.